Welcome everyone, and thanks for being with us for today's webinar, Making the Move to DevSecOps from DevOps, a webinar brought to you by AWS Marketplace. A reminder that this webinar is being recorded. You'll receive an email from us within a couple of days with the link to check out the recording on demand. Also, there's a Q&A box on your screen. When you submit a question, it'll disappear from your box and queue up on our side. But don't worry, we have it, and we'll ask those questions at the end. If we don't get to your question, we'll be able to follow up with you after the event. There's also a live chat, so jump in and have a conversation with your fellow IT pros. Also, be sure to check out the resources section for some more links to get some information. So let's get started. Our presenters today are Torsten Kaublitz from Change Healthcare, Benjamin Andrew from AWS Marketplace, and our host, Nick Cavalencia from Techvangelism. So Nick, I'll hand it to you to get started.
Thank you very much, David. Hey, welcome, Spiceheads. Glad you guys joined me today. Today's webcast is a little bit of a different format. It's a far more conversational format between myself and Benjamin and Torsten. And so we really want to make sure that we include you in on the conversation. So use the QA box for a couple things today while we do this. One is certainly ask questions. We're going to try to get to every single question, as David mentioned. But also if you've got comments, a quick story, I don't know, a funny joke, an anecdote, whatever it is you want to share that it's relevant to the conversation, make sure you put that in there, because as we're going through this conversation today, I'm going to be trying to watch this as closely as I can and include you in on the conversation to make sure that everything's kind of in context and that sort of thing, as opposed to just waiting to the end. But certainly if we don't go over every question throughout our conversation today, we will definitely try to get through it at the end of today's presentation. The other thing is this presentation is very light on slide content. There is, it's about 5 slides total, I think, besides this title slide that you're seeing right now, and there's not a lot of text. The real focus is on the conversation that we're having. So if you don't see the screen changing very much, I don't want you to think that something's wrong or maybe you're disconnected. Don't worry, it's very light on slide content, very heavy more on the conversation that we're having, and the goal is to really kind of educate on this topic around making that move from just DevOps to something more around DevSecOps. And so the place that I'm going to start, just to kind of introduce today's topic a little bit, is talk about that factor of, are you missing security? Now, if you're already utilizing the cloud, you're already very aware of the fact that DevOps is a really key element in doing so. If you're thinking about things like accelerated deployment, consistent implementation, those are some of the real key foundational factors around DevOps. Those things are what are facilitating the use of the cloud. The fact that you can, for example, very quickly spin up a new VM so you can put that into a test environment or utilize it for development and then spin it down when you're done, that kind of thing. That's all part of sort of the DevOps mentality. So it's very key to that shift to the cloud. But what ends up happening is that security isn't really a factor. I think that's probably pretty natural for most of you, just from the fact that really what you're doing is you're focusing on utilizing the cloud. I want to spin up that VM and then do the thing to the VM that I want to utilize it for, and then you spin it down and you're done, and that's what you're really focused on. In a lot of cases, it's very sort of temporal in its use, and so there's not a lot of longevity, but security gets overlooked. And the reality, though, of today, what we're really going to talk about in today's conversation, is that even these kinds of environments, as well as production environments that are in the cloud, but even these environments as well, they need security. And I gave you just a quick example of, let's say that you have a beta test of some application, and you've got users out on the internet on various types of user devices, maybe even on desktops, whatever they're using to access this beta application. Well, if that beta application is accessible to the web, that means it's accessible to attack. And so even those kinds of environments really have to have security involved. And so that's why the question kind of becomes for today is, why are you still at DevOps and why are you not looking at DevSecOps? And what we're going to spend our time doing today is talking about sort of how to define DevSecOps, what does it take to get there, what are some of the key elements that you really should be looking for, and then how to kind of move forward from there. The place that I'm going to start next, and we're going to start our conversation, is really around just defining what is DevSecOps. And I've got a couple of notes here, and then Benjamin, Torsten, I want to bring you guys in on the conversation here. You guys are, like I said, you're already really familiar with DevOps in the cloud. There's plenty of that around there, and a lot of organizations take advantage of that. But what ends up happening, and one of the key elements that kind of comes into play of why DevSecOps really becomes necessary for an organization that is utilizing DevOps in the cloud quite a bit, is this concept of sprawl without visibility. The idea there being that, let's say you've got a development team in India and they're spinning up some VMs, but at the same time you've got some kind of QA environment over in Michigan, somewhere totally different in the world, right? And that team is spinning up some VMs. And what ends up happening is you have this sprawl where all these different teams are spinning up these environments that they need to work in, and there's no visibility centrally on what's going on overall, and there's no coordination between them to make sure that there's at least some, let's call it a base configuration of security involved with those environments. So you end up having this real lack of visibility. Now, there's an obvious element when you try to define DevSecOps and you go, well, there's that sec right in the middle. That's what it defines. It's security in the middle of DevOps. Yeah, it is. It's pretty obvious. It's about security. And that is something that is going to be absolutely necessary. Like I'm talking about when I'm giving the example of the beta test environment or any other environment that's accessible to the cloud, it is critical. You do not want, you've got, this sort of reminds me of the idea when people start moving to the cloud, I think about the opportunistic nature of attack, where the cyber criminals are very aware of the fact that it's a lot easier, rather than trying to do something where it's very targeted, they'll do sort of a modern day equivalent of a war dialer, where they're going to try every IP address they can, every known port that's related to a given attack, things like that, to try and figure out who they should be or they can attack. And so it's critical as you move to the cloud, because you don't want to just haphazardly start putting things up in the cloud and making them accessible to attack. Or I should say susceptible to attack is probably a better way to put it. And so it certainly is about putting security in the middle of DevOps. It's sort of the obvious answer, but there's a real difference in the way that you should be approaching it. A lot of times security ends up being sort of thought in terms of preventive and responsive behaviors. Maybe if you think of just the simplest type of security that's sort of off topic here, but let's say antivirus on an endpoint. Well, we put antivirus in to prevent any kind of malware or viruses from getting on that machine. And then we have some kind of either a backup plan, or we have some other layered security after that should that antivirus fail in response to an attack. And that's typically how we think about it. But with DevSecOps, it's really a different mindset. Instead of thinking about how do I implement an environment and then secure it, which is sort of the in response to type of methodology or method of thinking. It's really about how do I approach this where security is an incorporated and integrated part of the design of the environments that we're spinning up in a DevOps environment. And so that's really where I think DevSecOps kind of really gets its meat, is that whole let's do security by design in the same way that we do DevOps by design. So let's do this. Benjamin, let me pull you into the conversation first. And Torsten, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. And maybe we can talk about first by outlining the reality of the environments that are in the cloud, and maybe talk a little bit about the sprawl problem. I'm guessing that the audience, if they're already familiar with DevOps, already doing DevOps, already leveraging the cloud, they're probably thinking that they have a solid grasp on what kind of environments are in use. So Benjamin, my question is sort of, do you think that they really do have that grasp, or is the sprawl much worse than they think?
I don't think anyone really has a complete understanding of everything going on in their environment. I think that the intent around putting sec or security into the DevOps practices is really to have an endeavor of understanding, first of all, what are all the environments. And I think Torsten's got some great examples, as he and I shared at reInvent this last November and talked through some of the challenges that his company had as he saw the different teams, stepping into DevOps in certain areas, and a lot of it starts with, just dev and test and playing around, learning. There's a lot of new services being introduced at a rapid pace, and so there's a lot of continual education going on. And I don't think that anyone really ever has a complete grasp of it, but I think as the company gets to the place that they realize, wow, more and more departments and users are accessing cloud services and more spend happening, it does, some of the business drivers that tend to cause businesses to look at this are things like spend. How much money are we spending on these different services and cloud usage, and should we perhaps put a policy in place and educate everybody on, hey, if you do it this way, we can save money. we can get economies of scale and discounts for volume. But I think, Torsten, would be probably a good time for you to chime in and talk about some of the things that you guys wanted to build automation around and putting security as a lens, as you mentioned, in the design.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for us especially, it was sort of a migration, and not every team adopted DevOps model in the beginning, so there was still a lot of manual creation of instances. And back to the sprawl problem, it was very common for a developer to spin up an instance and then go off and do something else and not realize that that's still running, weeks later, months later, and it's no one's managing it, right? So here's this instance that's sitting up there that's spending money, which is usually how we find them. We look at our costs and go, wow, that doesn't actually make any sense. Why are we spending as much as we are? But from a security and vulnerability perspective, you have this unmanaged machine that's got a public endpoint to it because they weren't necessarily using it for secured workload, but it is still connected inside your network, and it's still a point of vulnerability. And again, to my point, nobody even knows it exists, really. Not until you actually go through and take a inventory of your systems. And nobody. I mean, when you start multiplying this out in a large company where you have thousands of instances, taking an inventory of which of those are real and which of those are forgotten old machines already becomes a difficult problem. So that sprawl is critical to be managed. And having the mindset from the engineering perspective, so when you're on a DevOps team, thinking about security and thinking about ownership of that responsibility, so that you are making sure that those machines get shut down correctly, or if they are up, that they are registered correctly, tagged correctly, appear in the active reports, so that it gets billed correctly. All of that is absolutely critical.
There's several use cases I think that we see customers wanting to build automation around, and so it's we're not here to talk necessarily about new unique use cases, but we can highlight a few of them that are pretty common, and one of them being building a gold image of a Amazon machine image, where it's a self-service model that the customer can build that addresses security and compliance in a common standard of an AMI. So if you have a process of building a secure AMI factory, there's steps as you go through the process. You can learn and think through, like, where would I want to address security in this process, and so really a lot of that is just taking the time to step through the automation that you're building around a DevOps practice and ask yourself, what are the security risks and concerns here? And I don't think that security risks are necessarily all that new all the time. Some people think, oh, when it's cloud, we can ignore the basics, but I think the basics are still important to focus on. And then, what you would want to ask then is, well, what's different in the cloud? Is there something additional that I need to pay attention to? Is it identity and access? Is it user accounts, IAM roles? Is it visible from the public internet? Some of those types of questions, but a lot of it is really just applying standard security through every step, and we can dive into a couple of these examples. Another one would be a continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline. That's a common thing that customers are doing, more to build automation into their software development process. And so that's another example of something that we can talk through. What are the risks, and where should you be focusing? There's some customers that might say, well, I don't know how to figure out where the risks are, and that's where we would recommend working with a cloud-focused consulting partner or with professional services teams, but we can definitely give you some highlights here.
Yeah,
I love the fact that you mentioned Go ahead, Torsten.
Yeah, well, second, a lot of what we were just saying is that it's when we switch to having a DevOps model and we're thinking more It's plainly in the term, right? It's development and operations, and we start to think more about the operational side and using automation to automate a lot of that operational aspect. It's just as important. There was in the bigger organization, there's always been that security organization whose job it was to help us build and manage secure systems. And as we're bringing the automation into the full deployment pipeline, we need to bring in that security automation as well. And it's OS management, so the AMIs are obviously critical, but it's also, how do you manage your accounts, your VPCs? How do you build in monitoring and alerting? It's, in a way, how do you build in the policies that you have as a company into the automation that is part of the infrastructure that you're deploying on AWS, so that it can automatically respond to the events that you care about.
I love the fact that you both are mentioning some very specific security functions, security configurations, even some security products that kind of become a layered security model. You mentioned IAM is one. Baseline configuration, I think, was another one, that kind of thing. And I think this is really good because there was even a comment in the audience that I think you're talking about, and they were going towards, and I think if I look back, there was identity and access management is where they think we were going. But I love the fact that you guys are mentioning a number of different things that gives the audience some color here. So putting aside automation for a minute, because I've got a whole slide on that. We'll talk about automation in another slide here in a second. Can you guys, either of you, kind of provide the audience with sort of a baseline so they kind of have an idea of if they were going to implement this? And I'm not saying go to implementation yet, but just conceptually so they really get their handle on DevSecOps and sort of defining it. Give me like the top 3 things that you definitely think should be included in DevSecOps. Either of you, and if you want to do more than 3, that's fine. But what are the things that they really should be thinking about when you say DevSecOps should include? What does it look like?
Sure. I'll jump into this one because it's where I spend a lot of my time. I would say that there's a shared security model that Amazon publishes that clearly lays out the tiers of what Amazon's responsible and then what they say the customer is responsible for. And that's great. That makes perfect sense, and it's a good starting point. But once you're in there, you sort of have to figure out, well, what security aspects do I care about when I actually am deploying an application, and who has responsibility for that security side of it? Because you can't really think of it in the classic model of IT and security, where you just say, "Oh, that's a security issue. I'm going to let the security guys take care of it, and they'll watch it, monitor it." The reality is, they're new to the cloud as well. I mean, for most of us, it's a transition to the cloud. Their tools are data center tools. They're not necessarily aware of what you can and can't do in the cloud. And so that has to be an almost immediate partnership where you discuss, here's a policy. What does that policy mean in the cloud? And I'll give a really good example. It's in the high trust and HIPAA healthcare world. It's a policy that you have to have antivirus installed and active on all the servers. It's literally in the specification. That's great, but I'm using Lambda. So what's our company policy there? When I'm executing code, it's in the cloud. I don't have access to the server. That falls back below that who has responsibility line. And so that's a one where you have to negotiate with the security people and understand, like, what does my cloud security profile look like and who has what level of responsibility. And the points I would focus on initially is things like account management, VPCs, how are they managed, what does the subnet look like for an application team, what's the monitoring and alerting look like. We already talked about what does the production of images, AMIs look like, and then least privilege. Take a least privilege type of approach to how you're deploying and how you're building your infrastructure. And that, if you, I kind of put that at the end, but if you start with least privilege, that gets you a lot of the way there, and it's something that feeds into your DevOps process right from the beginning. So as you're writing your infrastructure code, make sure you're applying least privilege so that you have this nice layer cake of security at all of your services.
Yeah, that's excellent, Torsten. I think one concept I want to introduce, or maybe many of you the listeners have heard this before, but the concept of security competency or DevOps competency. So AWS has a partner network with thousands of partners that we work closely with to offer solutions to our customers, both in relationship with AWS as well as with offering those solutions to customers to be sold and deployed and managed within the AWS Marketplace, a digital catalog of software that's made available and designed to be utilized in the same way that AWS services are, which is in a utility pricing model and very easy to use. But the concept of competency is a program that allows us to highlight the solutions that are what we refer to as well architected. They are leveraging AWS services, native services. They are protecting native services. And I like Torsten's example of the requirement for anti-malware protection on every server or any cloud instance such as an AMI. And what does that look like when you're now moving to software as code, which is microservices or serverless, such as Lambda. And it's interesting the continual growth of services and introduction of new services that happen every year. The vendors that typically respond with solutions that are designed to protect these new types of services, and eventually the standards catch up and they introduce, for example, containers is a good example where recently now there are several different solutions that are designed to secure container workloads and also the management of containers. And some existing solutions such as Trend Micro Deep Security now have the ability to protect containers as well. And we'll see the same thing with Lambda and serverless. But one thing I wanted to highlight as we talk about what solutions are available through these processes that you're going through is to take a look at it from a perspective of a story. What is the thing you're trying to do? What is the project you're working on? What is the process you're building? And if you can define it by some common things that you see other people building, for example, and we've talked about a secure AMI factory. If you step through all the steps in that factory, what are the concerns along the way? And they're going to be native AWS services available at each step of the way. And then there's also going to be third-party services that have passed the AWS competency programs that we would recommend. And the reason that I'm going to highlight those is because these solutions are designed to work with AWS native services, and they augment or add additional value. So, for example, if we step through just the first couple steps in the AMI factory concept here, the importance of having a baseline AMI that's devoid of vulnerabilities that you're going to eventually publish out to your entire environment is pretty critical. So you want to look at, does this AMI have any vulnerabilities to start with? Is it clean? Is it devoid of any vulnerabilities? So you'd want to use a vulnerability analysis solution like Cloud Passage, Server Secure, which is going to reduce risk and offer continuous compliance monitoring of the internal policies, external regulations, et cetera. And then in addition to that, an additional thing that you should be focusing on is ensuring that the files are not changing. So you're looking at a file integrity monitoring solution, which Cloud Passage happens to offer as well. There's other great solutions that you could use that would scan the image initially to ensure that it's the latest and it's not tainted, and that would be, examples like Trend Micro Deep Security, and there's others, McAfee, Symantec. They also offer capabilities there as well, but that's just one example, one component of the story. But the idea is to take a story, step through it, and understand what are the risks, and we're here to help you.
So let's do this. There's even a question that kind of came in. I think that our next slide is really going to kind of address it. And Jay's asking, he's one of our Spice heads, saying, how are these going to be implemented to ensure that the development team adheres to the standards? And one of the answers here, Jay, is this concept that's actually on the next slide. So I'm using you as my segue. Thank you very much for doing my work for me. And it's doing security through automation. You heard Benjamin mention automation a little bit earlier on in our conversation today. And the idea here is there is a ton. When you think of security in general, if anyone says you have to have a layered security approach, maybe even put the cloud outside of it for the sake of conversation, you know that there's tons and tons of things you could be doing. Right? You could be doing, we've talked about antivirus, you talked about you have firewalls, you have virtual private connections, you have, in fact, I think I've got a little list here in one of my bullets. Yeah, I do. Monitoring, we've talked about policies, workflow, all this kind of stuff. It's all possible. And then going back to Jay's question, well, this is all great. It's great that you have all this stuff that you want to do. How do you actually make that work? And in fact, Jay, I love the question because behind that question, you actually talked about, I said, how are these going to be implemented to ensure each development team, you're right there, you're right in the critical part. How does each team achieve the DevSecOps standards? And the problem here is the word team, because a team implies people. And people are the weakest link, right? We all know we have this great idea. Let's make sure that the image is secure. It's got the right configuration. We've closed all the vulnerabilities by patching it, blah, 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 all this stuff, right? But at the end of the day, if an individual doesn't adhere to those policies, they decide to spin up their own image, that sort of thing, then you have a problem. And so the reality becomes that automation kind of becomes the key here. Utilizing automation, we're going to talk a lot about this, and this is really kind of what's going to enable DevSecOps to be successful, is leveraging automation to get to what you see there in that bullet, the rapid deployment that you want, but in a way where it's still secure. And that's really the idea here. So to kind of answer your question, I think, Jay, is how am I going to ensure that? By not putting it in the hands of the team in the first place. You're going to do it through automation. And in a previous call that Benjamin and Torsten and I had, there was discussion of this last bullet, this idea of a security-first mentality. And by starting there, and we talked about this a little bit before, by design was a phrase that I used in an earlier slide. By design, security-first mentality. You're thinking about how do we do all the things that are necessary for DevOps to work so I get those benefits of the rapid deployment and the consistent implementation and so on and so forth, but I do it in a way where it's secure. So Benjamin, let me do this. I know that you're admittedly biased because you work for Amazon, but would you maybe paint sort of a vendor neutral picture for the audience of how the cloud can be leveraged to automate security, and then that sort of bridges the gap there between what was DevOps and what should become DevSecOps?
So yeah, I'm biased. You're right. I'm biased against solutions that are designed to leverage the cloud services. I'll say the benefit of all the different AWS and cloud services available are the ability to automate processes that you would spend your development teams, again back to the people, would spend unmeasurable amounts of time doing things in a manual method, or I think worse than just doing things manually, it's the varying ways that people do things, and not everyone knows everything, not everyone has the whole perspective. So the benefit of a cloud center of excellence, and yes, I use that term to tee up a conversation that Torsten's going to have with us, the benefit of a cloud-first mentality or a cloud with security mentality is that you get everybody on board to understand what are the risks if we don't do this, and what are the benefits if we do. And the risks, there have been a number of breaches that we could look to recently, Equifax, for example, and just what could have been avoided by having the mentality of, hey, let's design this properly. Let's take the time to design each of these stories, as I mentioned, intentionally with security in the process. And then the benefit is that it's repeatable and that you don't have to train everybody to be thinking about security. You can leverage the folks that really understand security to design it into the process, to educate the teams. But if they build it into the automation, then it still allows everyone to go and do their own part without having to always think about it. So, Thorsten, you're great at talking about why a cloud center of excellence is so important, and I think it would be great not just to hear what that means, but also why that was so important to you guys.
Yeah, it really, once we created that, it really allowed us to focus on the right set of tools and support that we can give to the rest of the organization so that the teams are successful. And, I have a very strong, cloud first bias, a security first bias, but I would say even lower and closer to my heart is empowering the teams to move rapidly, this whole thing about rapid deployment. And so the thing about being in the cloud is being able to use those tools and work very quickly and work very effectively. And as you're bringing operations in the DevOps model, you're breaking down those silos and those barriers that slowed us down in our ability to deploy stuff originally. And so I'm very cognizant of not wanting to have a process that, brings that to a crawl, right? I don't want a CI/CD process where one of the steps is, pick up the phone and talk to a guy in InfoSec so that they can approve the machine image that you're going to use. So, and I'll get into that in a moment because that's a really interesting example. So for us, when we built out our Cloud Center of Excellence, we broke it up into three main categories. We had a steering committee that sort of sets the North Star and says, this is what we want to achieve in the cloud. We want to be DevSecOps. We want to have rapid deployment. We want to be secure. We're in a healthcare regulated environment, so that's obviously security is almost paramount. So they sort of set the North Star and this is where we're heading. Then we created a cloud tools organization whose job it was to build the automation tools for teams and for operations to use. So as we're figuring out our policies, we're building our policies and our controls into the environment, we want to make sure that they integrate naturally into a team's CI/CD process. And then we also created a cloud operations team whose job it is to work with the application teams, the DevSecOps teams, to get them up and running, and then also manage those components that we've decided as an organization do not fall to the teams, right? So again, the shared responsibility model, we took some things away from teams. For instance, we do not allow teams to create accounts because accounts, we want to manage the billing and we want to manage the user to a certain extent, and so we take that right away from our development teams and centrally manage that through our cloud operations group. And also back to automation, all of that they do through automation, right? So they're never logging onto a console and adding a user or anything like that. They user and team profiles and their network space and all of that is actually in YAML files that they maintain, each one file in the sense for every team, and then they submit that job to our CI/CD process that the tools team built that then that turns all of that into CloudFormation and executes it on AWS and manages those environments. So all of our central management for AWS is in code, and then we also take tools that we built like the Omni chain, the build chain for that, where we take the image that Amazon publishes and our system automatically grabs that, instantiates it, at the side it instantiates an Ansible server, it grabs a playbook out of that, applies it to the image, hardens the image to the Center of Internet Security Standards, once that's hardened, it builds, it recreates a new image, a candidate golden image, basically. And then that's instantiated. Another Ansible playbook is grabbed. That's our validation. And then that validation runs against the candidate AMI, validates to make sure that that's correct. But what's also fascinating with that is that all runs on AWS. It's all done through automation documents in AWS space, but it's also available for the teams, the application teams. So when they're building a image with, so they'll take our gold image, and then they'll want to modify it in some way so that they can put their services on there, their application code and all that fun stuff. But then it needs to be recertified so that it's still in compliance. So inside of their CI/CD process, after they've put their code on our gold image and created a new image, they then just resubmit that. It's like a candidate. They just resubmit it to our system. Our system will, again, bring up the Ansible playbook that validates it, instantiate their image, scan it, run the tests, come back with a notification that basically says pass, fail. Their CI/CD process can then branch off and either start or stop. So it's a very nice system that we can use for that kind of management.
I think we're onto something here, because I'm watching some of the comments coming in, and as I'm thinking about how we're talking about this, I'm starting to see the comments come in where they're asking like the right questions that are answered on the next slide. So I'm loving the content you just provided, both you provided, because I think that really lends itself towards the audiences now thinking about the very last slide that we have in this presentation today, as far as our discussion goes, which is really about this idea of how do you get to DevSecOps. And because some of the questions are like, one of the persons said, well, I would say it actually, if you want to get like the dev team, this is sort of the reference they made earlier when I was talking about the dev team, is you get them to care about priorities and security. You've got to speak their language, got to make sure it's in priorities that they care about, and that's correct. Another person's asking what tools should they use, and it's all in kind of an effort to, well, how do we actually implement this? And that's what I want to talk about last here. So what we've done so far is kind of level set and said this is kind of what DevSecOps is a little bit, provided some really good, strong examples, talk about the need for automation as part of doing it, because it's not going to be able to get done as a manual process, nor, more importantly, it doesn't need to. That's really the good news, because there's lots of tool sets out there in the AWS Marketplace. And so the last one here is, how do you get to DevSecOps? And so I have my universal IT answer, which we all know, it's the word it depends, right? It's the answer to every IT question there is. And it depends on a couple of things. And I've got just some high-level sort of considerations to be thinking about. And then Benjamin and Torsten, I want to kind of dive into this a little bit with you guys. It certainly depends on the tools you have available, right? So one of the Spice heads asked about here. Sundar said, "Can you provide sample security tools to be used with DevSecOps?" So we're going to talk about some of that. I actually have a question kind of that I wrote queued up for that to answer that question for you, Sundar. So don't worry. But it does available on. It matters what tools you have available to you in the first place. Otherwise, if you don't have, for example, lots of cloud tools, someone mentioned PowerShell in here in one of the comments, and you're thinking, well, then I'm going to have to script it myself, and that's kind of where my head went there for a moment. So it does depend on what's available to you, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in specific. It also really matters the integration. You heard Torsten talk about sort of the AMI chain of how they're building all of their images, and he went through a number of different processes. And the important thing there, that I don't know if you even mentioned the word, Torsten. If you did, I missed it, and that's okay. But if you didn't, that's okay too, is that all that's integrated. When he talks about making sure that the new image now is certified afterward, that there's a whole automated process that's integrated with each of these steps involved. Otherwise, you're going to be doing a lot of manual work, and I think none of us really want to work for a living. If I could, like, see a show of hands, I'm raising my hand here in my office. By a show of hands, who wants to work for a living? None of us want to work for a living. So integration is really kind of key to make the automation work, which is the next one here, having that automation as well, so that these different steps where maybe you're patching, and then another step is going to be you're going to reconfigure parts of the operating system specifically, and then another step is you're going to scan it to make sure there's no malware on it, and then there's another step. All those things need to be automated so that it just happens, because at the end of the day, the teams that are thinking more in the DevOps world and not so much the DevSecOps world, they just want to spin up a VM and get developing or get testing. That's all they want to do. They don't want to worry about all this other stuff. So this really has to be automated. And then to that comment earlier about speaking the people's language, and in my mind, it's sort of about creating a security culture where people are thinking about security. It really depends on your organizational approach and whether you can or can't, and how much of this is going to reside on security teams, how much of this is residing on the dev teams, IT, whether you are creating that culture of security where everyone should be thinking about this. All that kind of comes into play. So, Benjamin, let me pull you into the conversation. I've given, it's not really a roadmap, how to get to DevSecOps, but some different aspects that are on that path to getting to DevSecOps. What steps do you walk your customers through to get there? If they're thinking, okay, I want to go to DevSecOps, what do they have to do? What are the steps that you give them at a high level?
Well, at a high level, I think it always depends. The answer of it depends. I think what it depends on in my mind is what are they doing? What are they trying to accomplish? And if you can define what you're trying to accomplish first, and then if you're already using a common DevOps practice that other people have done and they've named it, there's terminology around it, then when you're looking for solutions, you can search based upon how do I secure a X process. And different vendors are going to have different viewpoints on it, but there's a lot of ways just by searching for, how does each vendor handle DevSecOps? If you spend any time with sort of again, back to the competency partners in AWS, that's a good place to start because you can, each of the vendors that have listed a solution are going to cover how does their solution help you with DevSecOps. And as an example, just looking at Dome 9, one of the ways that they talk about in the CI/CD pipeline is applying automatic remediation. So like stopping a rogue instance that doesn't comply with the policy. They had an open source project called Cloud Supervisor. And what they do is they monitor the policy that you've defined, and if an AMI or an instance doesn't meet that policy, then they automatically remediate it. There's other solutions that will do things like monitoring S3 and making sure that there's no credentials that are in S3 that are public to the world. You don't want your AWS accounts, mining Bitcoin, for example, over the weekend, and you come back with a really high bill. So automating these by when it sees that an S3 bucket is open to the world, then shutting it down and closing it automatically. So, but I think just as a starting point of learning, and I wish that there were a way for you to just say, hey, this is the DevSecOps thing I'm building, and what are all the solutions that cover this? And actually, to be honest, we're building that internally, and it's starting with documentation, like writing what are the stories, what are the vendors in each step, and that we're hiring in that space as well to find the right people to help us create this content, but because we all have our full-time day jobs. But anyway, a good place that you can start today is literally going to the competency page in AWS, finding the vendors that you see based upon the different categories of what they do, and then going and visiting their websites. They have content that is specific around AWS, specific around DevSecOps, and just educate yourself, learn. But if I were just to look down a list of common security use cases, there are a number of vendors that already provide sort of automated security in each of these. Like if you think about security intelligence or user entity behavior analysis, you've got solutions like SIEM, in the SIEM space like Splunk Cloud, Alien Vault. You've got application compliance tools like Chef Automate or Puppet. There's also compliance monitoring tools. I mentioned Dome 9 earlier, but Alien Vault, Evident.io, which is now part of Palo Alto Networks. Vulnerability analysis tools, there's a number of those, but the one that we highlight is Cloud Passage. They're just working closely with us and well-architected solution. But there's other ones on the market like Tenable and Qualys and Rapid7. If you look at security policy, there's managing security policies, managing privilege access, separation of duties. There's vendors like Centrify, Savient, CyberArk. Again, I could talk for 15, 20 minutes just on different vendors in each of these spaces, but ultimately, hopefully that's a place to get you started.
Yeah, and I would add to that, there's a lot of tools out there, but back to the comment about having to write the code. Yeah, there's code that needs to be written here. Ideally, automation, right? And so you're going to want to write deeper automation to also include security things. Specifically, the example that Benjamin had about Dome 9 being able to detect and shut down a rogue army. That's a policy you have to create internally that you want to do that, and how do you identify those armies, and then how do you identify the rogue? Now, it's great that there are tools out there, but ultimately that is a decision that's in our, for us, we have the Cloud Center of Excellence that has a security representative in that organization. And when we chatted through these issues, we identified them and decided, yes, we want to wrap automation around that, and found the resources to do that and make that happen, because it's critical for our industry, for us in our industry. But you have to identify those policies. And
so the last thing I'm thinking of,
automate.
Torsten, I'm just wondering, you mentioned the whole sort of AMI chain, and you went through that kind of as your own experience. What tools did you find that were needed to kind of create a start-to-finish application of the company getting to DevSecOps? I'm trying to think of sort of applying what you did to what the audience can do to get to DevSecOps. Can you kind of walk through some of the tools that you used?
Sure. So we used a lot of just, we did not use a specific cloud security tool. So this has been a journey over the last 4 years for us, with automation being a key factor. So we ended up writing a lot of stuff to do this. So specifically, we have a policy management tool that we use internally that I was talking about, where teams are basically described in YAML files. So that handles all of our operational aspects. And then inside of the Army production tool chain that we recently deployed, that's built on top of Amazon's systems manager, and uses a system manager automation documents to drive the automation. And specifically inside, it uses Ansible for many of the controls that we want to apply, or validations we want to apply against a running instance. So again, we spent a fair amount of time writing our own stuff, but to Ben's point, right, the market is maturing a lot in this space, and if I had to do it over again, I think I really would start with what does the market offer now that it didn't offer, just 2 years ago.
Good stuff, good stuff. Let's do this. We've got, it looks like 12 minutes left. I see there's some questions in the Q&A box I definitely want to get to. Let me just put a little summary on all of this to kind of finish the conversation today, and then let's take some of these questions, and that way we'll end up being right at the top of the hour, which would be very good. So the last thing I just here again, just trying to sum this up. The goal is to try and put security in the middle of DevOps, and that's what we're trying to do here. The assumption that we're making today is you're already doing some level of automation in your DevOps, so that's already being done. And so really it's about the approach needs to include security. That's really what the sec portion is. It's how do you take the exact same principles, the exact same methodologies that you're applying to DevOps, but include it proactively, security first minded, by design like we talked about, and include that in. And so I see it as just requiring kind of three things that we've talked about today a little bit. The first one is you need the right cloud tools. And if you don't have them, to Torsten's point a moment ago, you build something. If you don't, you code it yourself. But you need a set of tools that are going to do this in order to create an automated workflow that's going to do this for you. And a lot of it, I put as this last one, I put commitment. And my thinking here is that it really involves a commitment to doing this, not a commitment like you're a committed person or you're a committed organization, but more so that you're committed to this process because you're looking at, to some of the things that Benjamin and Torsten talked about earlier, looking at what the organizational needs are, what are your objectives when you try to move something to the cloud, what are your objectives when it comes to security, and then actually committing to try and have that not just implemented not just, let's say all you want to do is patch systems for the sake of conversation. It's not just we patch systems, but you're actually committed to figuring out a way to automate the patching of systems as part of the DevOps process, if you will. That way every system is consistently implemented and quickly deployed, and that way your CI/CD process includes the idea of patching a system and any other type of security thing that you might want to do. So that's the real kind of key here. Why don't we do this? Benjamin, I know you don't have any slides, but if I may, can I ask you just to quickly, you've done a smattering of talking about AWS Marketplace and some of the different partners and that kind of thing throughout the presentation, but would you at least maybe spend a minute or two and kind of talk about what the offering can do for those people in the audience that maybe have either nothing or are looking for the right solution, or what does AWS Marketplace provide them in terms of DevSecOps?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks. So, I think when customers are moving to the cloud or extending their environments to the cloud, there's some business changes around the way they procure things. They're, instead of procuring hardware and building data centers, now they're leveraging IT resources and services over the internet and paying for it in a pay-as-you-go manner in more of an OpEx rather than a CapEx purchase. And as we see more and more customers adopting cloud now, AWS has millions now of active customers. Many of them want to be able to procure software the same way that they procure AWS services. So what we do in our team and Marketplace is we've built a digital catalog of software that's designed to help the customer in the journey to leveraging AWS. And one of the most common concerns, probably the most common question and concern that comes first is my data secure? Are my users secure? Is my identity secure? And how do I build secure applications on AWS? And that, as Torsten mentioned earlier, that shared responsibility model is that AWS is responsible for the security of the infrastructure from the hypervisor all the way down to the physical hardware and the data centers and physical security. But the customer is really responsible leveraging third-party software, and AWS help. They're responsible to develop secure applications. They're responsible for their own data. They're responsible for their identities. And while the data by default is not publicly available, not available to the world, like when they're using S3, they have to intentionally share S3 folders or buckets to make them available. Many people do that without always thinking about what are the ramifications. So by leveraging third-party solutions that are available in the marketplace, that are priced in a way that's similar to cloud services. They're sold in a utility pricing model, paying based on their usage, which means it translates to I don't have to spend a lot of money on software until my growth and my adoption of cloud, grows to the point, to a higher point. So it gives you the ability to test and try things out without having a big penalty up front. You can still do it in a secure way. You can still use security solutions, but pay based on your usage, number of secure, AMI instances or amount of traffic. Like if you think about, as an example, Trend Micro sells their deep security charged for a few cents per AMI instance. It's really inexpensive. So, and other vendors like Barracuda offers their cloud workload protection, their web application firewall protection. They offer it in a utility priced model as well, so you can actually pay based upon the amount of bandwidth that your website or your application might use. So, these are great ways that we work with the vendors to help them make it easy for you as a customer to adopt the cloud without having a upfront penalty of having to design out a huge expensive environment. So the amount of customers currently buying out of AWS Marketplace, we have over 160,000 customers buying every month out of AWS Marketplace from over 4,300 solutions from over 1,280 individual software vendors. So the growth has been tremendous, and we have a fairly expansive catalog of a lot of the most common solutions people are looking for, but we're continuing to add, and we're continuing to recruit vendors and even give vendors recommendations of areas to look at, like I mentioned earlier, securing serverless and securing containers. And with containers as an example, we have AquaSec, we have Twistlock, and there's other vendors coming on board, but now there's a lot of startup vendors that we work with as well that are focusing on serverless and how do you secure an environment end to end that includes Lambda, and it includes containers, and it includes AMIs, it includes on-premise. So anyway, the purpose of the marketplace really is to make solutions available to you in an easy way to procure, easy way to deploy, easy way to manage, and continue to curate that set of solutions.
That's perfect. Thank you. So we've got about 4 minutes left. There's a number of questions here for you Spice Heads. As mentioned at the beginning of today's presentation, if we don't get to your question today, someone from Amazon will reach out to you, make sure you get your question answered. There's a real interesting one here from Constantine. He says, almost any stakeholder is more interested in the development speed than overall security. In the case of a rapidly changing market needs, he says, how can we assess the security value in that case? And I think what he's really trying to make the case for is just how do we tell the business you got to worry about security in this case?
Just point them at all of the people who are out there in the cloud that got their companies basically destroyed by getting hacked. I mean, the attacks are so continuous. You don't want to be on that list. And when back to how we started this conversation, it's so easy to spin up an image, an instance, have it sitting up there, have it maybe connected to your network. It's a test image, so you used it for your test, and then you walk away from it, and months later, half a year later, somebody finds it and hacks it, and all of a sudden, they're in your network, east-west attacking you. So this, with great power comes great responsibility, right? You can't have all that power to spin up those instances and use them without actually the controls in place. That is just, if you have a hard time explaining that to the business, give me a call. I'll help you.
Thank you, Uncle Ben. Appreciate that. David, Benjamin, you want to add anything to that?
I think earlier, Nick, you mentioned that there's challenges around getting the business and the executive team in the business that you work for to understand the importance of a cloud-first mentality. There's actually an exercise that the AWS Pro Services team does at reInvent, and they might be doing it at summits as well, but you can also hire them to come out to your office and do this, and it's a security simulation workshop where they go through, what are the decisions that need to be made from an executive level, and what executive alignment needs to happen in order to become a cloud-first company. So I would look for that at reInvent, and potentially if you guys are in that place where you just need some support, it's a good tool as well. But there's actually some handouts we're giving out. I know we're running out of time, but there's some handouts available here on the screen, but also we're going to be following it up with an email that provides some useful content around simplifying network operations and increasing security. There's a Forrester report. We're also giving you a couple $100 worth of AWS promotional credits when you subscribe. to any of the products that we've listed on a site that we're sending you a link for. So I wanted to highlight some of the things that were given out at the end of this conversation too.
Good stuff. Looks like we're at the top of the hour there. So I think what we're going to do here is kind of finish things up, wrap it up. We obviously didn't get to a lot of questions today, but we'll definitely make sure someone reaches out to you and gets those questions answered. So Benjamin, Torsten, hey guys, thank you very much for a great conversation today. I think it was really helpful getting both sort of a vendor-to-vendor neutral kind of approach as well as a customer approach to looking at DevSecOps. So appreciate that from both of you.
Thanks for joining.
Fun.
Yeah, good stuff. Spiceheads, thanks for your attendance today. Thanks for your participation. We tried to get to as many comments as we could. Sometimes these things just don't work out in our favor, but we do appreciate you participating. And with that, David, I'm going to hand things back to you.
All right, great. Thanks, Nick. So thank everyone for your participation today. A lot of great questions. And remember, if you stepped out or missed any part of today's presentation, you'll be getting that email I mentioned with a link to view the webinar on demand. And as mentioned before, there's a lot of great information in the handout section, and then also look for those links in the follow-up email. So thanks to AWS Marketplace for sponsoring this great event. Thanks to all of you for tuning in today. We'll see you next time for another Sparks First Partner webinar. Everyone stay safe and keep it spicy.